He had not planned to stop. That was the thing Marcus Hale kept telling himself later, in the weeks when everything had already changed and the telling no longer helped. He had not planned to stop. The car was supposed to slow at the corner of 63rd and Linden, let him check his phone, confirm the address of the contractor complaint, and keep moving. He had a pitch at 9:15 in the Loop. The investors were flying in from New York. One of them managed a sovereign wealth fund that could take Hale Residential Group from a $4.1 billion portfolio to something closer to $6. He had not planned to stop, but then he saw the paint. It was just a stripe, really. A 6-inch band of dried robin's egg blue along the lower frame of the front entrance, partially bubbled now, salt-cracked from 30-odd winters, but still there. Still exactly the shade that the hardware store on Cottage Grove sold for $8.99 a quart in 1989. Marcus knew the shade because he had carried the quart home on his bicycle, wobbling under the weight of it, a rag stuffed in the waistband of his jeans. He had been 17. The building superintendent, a barrel-chested Pole named Kowalski, had told him, "Paint the doorframe, the stairwell rail, and the garbage enclosure. I'll knock $20 off November's rent." $20 was 2 nights of bus fare and 1 decent meal. Marcus had painted. He had not thought about that paint in possibly 20 years. The car stopped because he told it to stop. Dimitri, his driver of 9 years, did not ask questions. He pulled the Escalade to the curb outside Linden Court, a 4-story walk-up of 32 units on the south side of Chicago, and he did not speak because Marcus did not speak. Marcus just looked at the frame. The building was a Hale residential property. It had been the first one, technically, the first distressed asset he had acquired when he was 28, still carrying debt from his finance degree, still sleeping on his cousin's pull-out sofa in Wicker Park. He had paid $390,000 for it at a foreclosure auction, borrowed from 3 different sources at rates that would make his current loan officers flinch. He had fixed the boiler, painted the hallways, replaced 2 units worth of copper pipe, and raised rents by 8%, still below market, and within 14 months, the building was cash positive. That first success was the whole story of Hale Residential Group, distilled. Find what's broken, fix it, profit from the fixing. Grow. He had not been back since 2012, standing on the sidewalk now in a suit that cost more than the monthly rent of half the units inside. Marcus did the arithmetic he always did without thinking. 32 units, average rent of $1,340 per month per current system data, 94.3% occupancy rate as of last quarter's report. He pulled those numbers from memory, because numbers were the language in which Marcus thought. He thought in occupancy percentages and rent-to-income ratios and quarterly cash flows. He had thought this way for so long that it had stopped feeling like a choice. It just felt like the shape of reality. His phone buzzed. The pitch. 9:15. He was about to tell Dimitri to pull around when he heard it. Not crying exactly. More like the sound of crying that had been going on long enough that the person doing it had passed through the loud part and come out on the other side into the quieter, harder kind. The kind that comes out in shallow waves and doesn't stop even when the person holding it wants very much for it to stop. It was coming from the alcove just inside the building's main entrance, the small vestibule behind the propped-open security door. Marcus's first instinct, and he would be honest about this later in ways that cost him, was to keep walking. He had learned, over 30 years of managing properties in under-resourced neighborhoods, that emotional scenes on site were best handled by property managers, not owners. He had frameworks for this. He had a chain of command. He took 2 steps toward the car. He heard a child's voice say, "Mama, look, I drew it with the roof this time." Marcus stopped. He turned. In the alcove, sitting on a cardboard box that was one of 7 cardboard boxes arranged around her like a small city of collapsed things, was a woman. She was perhaps in her early 30s, dressed in a set of navy blue scrubs that still had a hospital ID clipped to the breast pocket, and she was holding a piece of paper that a small boy, Marcus estimated 6, maybe 7 years old, had pressed into her hands. On the paper was a crayon drawing of a house. It had a peaked roof and a door and 4 windows, and in the upper left corner, where houses in children's drawings sometimes have suns, this one had what appeared to be 2 stick figures standing in front of the house together. The woman looked at the drawing. She tried to smile. She almost made it. "It's beautiful, baby," she said. "I drew us a new one, Mama," the boy said. His voice was entirely serious, the way small children are serious when they have decided something important. "This one nobody can take." Marcus stood on the sidewalk and felt something happen in his chest that he did not have a word for. He had not had a word for it in a very long time, because the last time he'd felt it, he had been 17 years old, and he had painted a door frame for $20 and believed, with the particular ferocity of the young and scared, that the only way out of this kind of mourning was to never stop moving forward until the mourning was behind him. Years behind him, so far back that he couldn't feel it anymore. He felt it now. He looked at the stack of boxes. He looked at the older girl, 9, maybe 10, sitting apart from her mother, headphones around her neck, watching Marcus with an expression that managed to be simultaneously frightened and magnificent in its contempt. He looked at the boy, Leo, who had turned around and was now looking up at Marcus without any particular fear or judgment, just the calm assessment of a child who has spent too much of his recent life watching adults. "You live here?" Marcus asked. He didn't know why he asked it. It was obvious. "We did," the woman said. She did not look up at him. On the wall beside the vestibule door, taped at eye level, was a piece of paper. Marcus moved closer and read it. It was a copy of a notice to vacate, the standard form, 6-day notice, processed through the Hale Residential Automated Leasing Management Portal. At the bottom, in the signature field, was the name Craig Sutton, VP of Operations, Hale Residential Group. Marcus looked at the paper for a long time. His phone buzzed again. The pitch. He looked at the woman in the scrubs. He looked at Craig Sutton's name on the document. He looked at the stripe of robin's egg blue paint along the doorframe, which had somehow survived 37 years of Chicago winters, which had survived under 2 previous owners and a foreclosure and 14 tenants, and his own absence, which was still there despite the fact that the man who painted it had spent the last 3 decades doing everything in his power to forget the morning that made him paint it. "What's your name?" Marcus said. The woman looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were dark and very tired and entirely without the deference that most people adopted when they realized who he was, which told him she did not know who he was, and for a reason he couldn't immediately explain. That felt important. "Diane," she said. "Diane Reyes." Marcus nodded. He picked up his phone. He called Dimitri around. He told the investor's assistant that he needed to reschedule. He did not yet know what he was going to do. He only knew that he was not going to get back into the car. That was the morning. That was where it started. The Hale Residential Group occupied floors 28 through 31 of a glass tower on West Madison, and on the morning that Marcus Hale walked into the building an hour late and went directly past his assistant's desk without stopping, 3 different people tried to intercept him with 3 different things that each thought was urgent. He told all 3 of them he would get back to them. He went to his office, closed the door, sat down, and called Craig Sutton. Craig arrived in 8 minutes. He was 47, trim, efficient, with the particular brand of polished confidence that Marcus had always respected and was, this morning, finding profoundly irritating. Craig set his tablet on the conference table by the window and said, "The New York call. Sheldon is fine with rescheduling, by the way. He said Thursday." "Sit down, Craig." Craig sat. "Linden Court," Marcus said. 32 units, 63rd and Linden, South Side. "Acquisition number 14, Craig said without missing a beat. He had that too, the perfect recall of the portfolio, the ability to pull any property by address or acquisition number or year. It was a useful quality, and Marcus had relied on it for 6 years. What about it? There's a woman and 2 kids sitting in the vestibule with 7 boxes. Craig's expression did not change in any alarming way. It adjusted, very slightly, into the register of careful professionalism. Reyes, he said. Unit 2C. She received the non-renewal notice through the automated system. Notice was issued 16 days ago. She had 6 days to respond under the Chicago Residential Landlord and Tenant Ordinance, and the non-renewal was confirmed when she missed the response window. The lockout was scheduled for this morning. Walk me through why she's being removed. Craig reached for his tablet. He pulled up the property management dashboard. He turned it so Marcus could see. The Clarity system flagged her unit 8 weeks ago. Her rent-to-income ratio crossed the threshold we set for non-renewal priority. The system calculates based on reported income against market-adjusted rent. When we rolled out the dynamic market pricing module last year, about 4,200 units across the portfolio got repriced to closer to market rates. Linden Court went up 11%. Ms. Reyes had been paying, he scrolled, $1,280 per month. The new rate for 2C is $1,420. Her reported income is $2,810 per month. She works part-time at Holy Cross as an LPN, which puts her at a 51.1% rent-to-income ratio. Our non-renewal threshold is 50%. 1.1%, Marcus said. The threshold is the threshold, Craig said, not unkindly. If we make exceptions, the model stops working. The whole value of the Clarity system is consistent application. Marcus looked out the window at the skyline. 28 floors down, Lakeshore Drive was a slow crawl of morning commuters. He thought about the way it had looked when he was a boy, looking at it from the other direction, from the south side, where the lake was something you saw only if you walked far enough east, past everything that needed walking past first. Pull up her file, he said. The actual file, not the dashboard summary. Craig hesitated for just a moment, so brief that Marcus might have imagined it, before navigating to the tenant record. He handed over the tablet. Marcus read. He was not, in ordinary circumstances, a person who read tenant files. He had a VP of property operations for that. He had regional managers, site managers, a compliance team, an automated system that, he was beginning to understand, made the majority of residency decisions on his behalf without requiring his attention. He had built a company with 47,000 rental units across 12 states by being very good at not needing to read individual tenant files, by building systems that scaled, by hiring people he trusted to operate those systems within the parameters he'd set. So he read the file now with the full awareness that he had probably never once, in the 9 years since the Clarity system's predecessor was first deployed, sat down and read a tenant file in this level of detail. Diane Reyes, age 34, moved into Unit 2C of Linden Court in March 2020. 4 years and 3 months of tenancy. 48 months of rent due over the course of that tenancy. Rent paid on time, 47 months. Rent paid late, 1 month. The late month was June 2022, when her payment was 9 days past the first of the month and consequently triggered a $75 late fee. The note in the file from the property manager at the time read, "Tenant called to explain that her hospital reduced part-time staff hours during a scheduling restructuring. Payment received in full, including late fee. Tenant history otherwise exemplary. 47 out of 48 months. $3.97 below a threshold. 6 days to respond to a notice she may or may not have understood was a notice and not a rent increase warning. One morning with 7 boxes in a vestibule. 2 kids. The boy who drew the house. Was there a human review of this case before the lockout was authorized? Marcus asked. Craig kept his face neutral. The Clarity system handles non-renewal processing. Human review is triggered automatically when a tenant submits a written appeal through the portal or contacts the leasing office directly. Did she do either of those things? Craig scrolled to the communication log. She called the leasing office twice. The first call was routed to the automated information line. That's the default for non-business hours. The second call was during business hours and was handled by the leasing office team. There are 3 notes from that call. He read them aloud. First note, tenant inquired about non-renewal reason. Second note, referred tenant to Clarity Portal for formal appeal process. Third note, tenant informed of appeal deadline. The appeal was not submitted. Why not? I don't know. We don't have visibility into that. Marcus handed the tablet back. He stood up and went to the window. Below him, cars moved in the slow, patient drift of people who had somewhere to be. He thought about a 17-year-old on a bicycle with a quart of robin's egg blue paint. Tell me about the Clarity system, he said. The version we're running now. When did we implement the dynamic pricing module? 18 months ago, Craig said. The board approved the capital expenditure in November 2 years ago. Full rollout began the following February. It's been performing extremely well. Portfolio revenue is up 8.3% year over year. Vacancy rates are down to 4.1% across the residential division, and the non-renewal processing time dropped from an average of 42 days to 11. The system's been a significant operational win. 8.3%, Marcus said. On a $680 million revenue base, roughly $56 million in additional annual revenue. Yes. Marcus turned from the window. When we implemented it, were there any concerns raised about how the dynamic pricing module would interact with lower-income tenants? Craig's expression shifted. It was a very small shift, the kind that someone watching closely might notice and someone not watching closely definitely would not. And Marcus was always watching closely. He had built a $4 billion company by watching closely. There were some implementation questions raised during the rollout planning process, Craig said. Standard operational considerations about threshold calibration. The system's parameters were reviewed by the compliance team. What kind of questions? Craig picked up his tablet. He opened a document. He closed it again. There was a flag raised in the system documentation, he said, about the potential for the rent-to-income threshold to interact differently across different income brackets. The flag was addressed during the calibration review. Addressed how? The threshold was adjusted from 45% to 50% to give lower-income households more flexibility. And then it stayed at 50%. Yes. And Diane Reyes is at 51.1. Yes. Craig. Marcus kept his voice completely level. What was the flag, the original one? Who raised it? A pause. Not long. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. It was filed as a documentation note by Priya Nair, who was my chief of staff at the time. The note was attached to the capital expenditure memo as a supplementary annex. Craig kept his eyes on the table. The memo went to the board for approval. The main document was the memo itself. The annexes were available. They were part of the package. The annexes were there, Marcus said, and I approved the budget. The board approved the budget, yes. Marcus sat down again. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at them. For a long time, the office was quiet, except for the ambient sound of 4,700 miles of Hale Residential Group running itself on the other side of the glass walls. Where is Priya now? He said. Craig blinked. It was the first time all morning that Craig Sutton had blinked at a question. She left the company about 14 months ago. She's the policy director at a housing advocacy nonprofit. Heartland Housing Defense, I think. Get me her number. Marcus. Not a request, Craig. Craig nodded once. He started to stand. Then he stopped, still half-seated, and he looked at Marcus with an expression that Marcus recognized because he had worn it himself 100 times in the early years, when he'd been the one sitting across the table from someone with more money and power, trying to decide how honest to be. The system is working, Craig said. I want you to understand that. $56 million of additional revenue, 4.1% vacancy. The portfolio is healthier than it's ever been. If we start making individual exceptions, 47 out of 48 months, Marcus said quietly. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. A woman who has been paying us rent for 4 years, on time, Every single month except one, when she was working fewer hours because a hospital cut her schedule and she still paid the late fee on top of it, is sitting in a vestibule with her children and 7 boxes. And the reason is that she is 1.1 percentage points over a threshold that a computer set. Craig said nothing. The system is working, Marcus said. I understand that. I approved the system. I am not disagreeing with you about the system's performance. What I'm telling you is that I want Priya Nair's number, and I want the full documentation package for the Clarity system rollout. The memo, the annexes, everything. On my desk within the hour. Craig stood. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. For what it's worth, Craig said. And this time his voice had dropped out of its professional register into something flatter and truer. When I designed the system, I believed in it. I still believe in it. The numbers support it. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I know, Marcus said. He meant it. That was, in some ways, the most complicated part. Get me the file. Craig left. Marcus sat alone in his office for a while after that. He looked out the window at the city. He tried to remember the last time he had been inside a unit in one of his buildings. Not the lobby. Not a conference room with a building manager. Inside a unit. He realized he genuinely could not remember. His father's voice surfaced, the way it sometimes did when Marcus was very still. Elmore Hale, who had worked 31 years in a packaging plant in Gary, Indiana, who had never owned anything and had not wanted to own anything, who had said to his son one night over a kitchen table, "Numbers don't cry, Marcus. People do. You choose which one to listen to." Marcus had always thought his father was giving him permission to choose the numbers, to be rational, to not let feelings make him soft. He sat there, in his $4,100 suit in his office on the 28th floor, and he wondered, for the first time, if he had understood that sentence correctly. The Heartland Housing Defense Office was in Pilsen, on the 2nd floor of a converted tortilleria, and it smelled like the building's previous life, corn masa and warm oil, in a way that was either poetic or just the result of inadequate ventilation, depending on what you brought to the experience. Marcus Hale did not go there first. He went first to the number Craig had given him, called it, and got a voicemail that said, crisply and without warmth, "This is Priya Nair. Leave a message." He left a message. He did not say who he was, which he recognized was probably not as clever as it felt, given that Priya would certainly recognize his number. He said he needed to speak with her about Linden Court. He said it was important. He said please, which was a word he did not use often in professional contexts and which felt, the moment he said it, like exactly the right word. Then he drove to the temporary shelter on West 51st, where Diane Reyes and her children had been placed. He did not call ahead. In retrospect, this was a failure of ordinary consideration. The shelter was a converted church gymnasium. 32 cots, fluorescent lighting, a folding table of donated food near the entrance, the patient institutional smell of too many people sharing too small a space. A volunteer at the door, a young black woman with a clipboard and a manner that was professionally kind in the specific way of people who had seen many Marcuses walk through the door, stopped him. "Can I help you? I'm looking for Diane Reyes. Marcus paused. He realized, about to say he was a friend, which was not true, and then about to say he was the owner of the building from which she'd been evicted, which was true, but also, in this context, approximately the worst thing he could say. He settled on, "I know her from Linden Court. I wanted to make sure she and her kids are okay." The volunteer looked at him for a long moment. His suit was a problem. His suit was always, in this context, a problem. "Just a moment," she said. She went away. She came back 4 minutes later and said, "She said she doesn't want to visit." Marcus nodded. He had expected this. He had not expected it not to sting. He sat down on a bench in the entryway, inside the door, but outside the main space, and he waited. He was not entirely sure what he was waiting for. He told himself he would wait 15 minutes and then leave his business card with the volunteer and go back to the office and deal with this the way he dealt with everything, which was to build a structure around it, to make it into a policy, to use the memory of this morning to drive process change at sufficient scale that it mattered. He was on minute 11 when a woman came through the interior door and stopped in front of him. And she was not Diane. She was perhaps 5 years older than Diane, and she had Diane's dark eyes and Diane's posture, that precise vertical alignment that suggested someone who had carried a great deal for a long time and had decided very early on that slouching was not an option. She was wearing a blue Henley and jeans, and she was holding a cup of coffee like a small weapon. "I'm Carmen," she said. "Diane's sister, Marcus Hale." Carmen looked at him with the bright, exact attention of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion. "I know who you are," she said. She sat down on the other end of the bench, a deliberate distance away. "I Googled the address when Diane called me at 6 in the morning. Your company owns Linden Court." "Yes. Then you know why she doesn't want to see you." "Yes." Carmen held her coffee with both hands. She looked straight ahead at the door rather than at him. "Diane has been at Holy Cross for 6 years. Before Holy Cross, she was at University of Chicago Medical Center for 4 years. She works nights and weekends. She got her LPN certification while she was pregnant with Leo and taking care of Mia at the same time." Carmen paused. She took a sip of coffee. "She is one of the hardest working people I know, and I'm including myself in that comparison." "And I'm not a modest woman." Marcus said nothing. "She paid that rent," Carmen said. "Every single month. She went without things to pay that rent. I want you to understand what that means, what she went without. She didn't have her teeth looked at for 3 years because she couldn't justify the copay. She bought Mia's school shoes at the Goodwill on Halsted and prayed they'd last through spring. She paid that rent." "I know," Marcus said. "I read her file." Carmen turned to look at him for the first time, and the look was both precise and without mercy. "Well," she said, "I'm glad her life was in a file somewhere." Marcus took that. He deserved to take it. "She's not going to see you today," Carmen said. "She might not see you at all. She's not obligated to make you feel better about this." "She's not," Marcus agreed. Carmen studied him. She had the manner, he thought, of someone who was professionally skeptical of him, but also, somewhere behind the skepticism, genuinely unsure what to do with the fact that he was sitting here at all. Most of the property owners she had probably dealt with in Diane's situation sent lawyers and form letters. "What do you want?" she said. "I want to understand what happened, and then I want to fix it." "Fix it how?" "I don't know yet." He said it honestly, which meant he said it without the smooth confidence that normally shaped his speech. He said it the way he had said things when he was 28 and still figuring out what came next. "I want to start by understanding it completely. The system that flagged her unit. I authorized the funding for that system 18 months ago. I didn't read the full documentation before I signed off. That's not an excuse. That's a fact I'm starting with." Carmen was quiet for a moment. "You came here to tell her that?" "I came here because I didn't know what else to do." He paused. "That's also a fact." Carmen looked at him for a long time. She appeared to be conducting some kind of internal deliberation that Marcus was not privy to. Then she stood up and she said, "I'm going to tell her you came. I'm not going to make her talk to you. If she decides she wants to, I'll be here too." She went back through the door. Marcus sat alone for another 20 minutes. Through the walls, he could hear the gymnasium, voices, the scrape of cot legs on the floor, a child asking something, the kind of institutional ambient noise that becomes, eventually, simply the sound of people enduring. Leo's voice was not distinguishable from it. He hoped Leo was drawing. He went to his car. He called his chief legal counsel, a methodical woman named Susan Park, who had been with the company for 11 years and who had a quality that Marcus valued above almost everything else in his employees, which was that she told him exactly what she thought, even when she thought it would not be what he wanted to hear. He told her about Linden Court. He told her about the notice and the file and the 47 months. He told her about Priya's flag. He said he needed her to pull the full Clarity System documentation, not the summary, the full package, and have it on his desk by the time he got back to the office. Then he drove. He drove through the South Side with no particular destination, which he had not done since he was young, since the years when driving with no destination was what you did when you were too keyed up to sit still and too broke to go anywhere. He drove past the 79th Street corridor, where he had worked his first actual real estate job, a summer internship with a property management firm that paid $9 an hour and taught him, mostly, everything he did not want to do. He drove past the park where he and his mother had gone on Sunday afternoons because it was free and the lake was there, and some days you needed the lake. He drove past the Jewel Osco, where he had bought groceries in the careful, calculating way of someone with $23 and a list, checking each price twice before it went into the cart. He thought about Diane Reyes checking prices. He thought about Mia's school shoes from the Goodwill on Halsted. He thought about the late fee of $75 in June 2022, which was 9 years after Marcus had reached a personal net worth of $75 million, and which he had, at that point in 2022, more than covered in rounding errors on any given quarterly report. He thought about what his father had said, and he let himself sit with the other interpretation, the one he had spent 30 years not considering, which was that his father had been telling him, "You will always have a choice. The numbers will always be there. But people also cry. And choosing the numbers does not make the crying stop. It just means you're not in the room to hear it." His phone rang. The number was Pilsen area code. He answered. "This is Priya Nair," the voice said. It was calm and professional, and carried underneath both those qualities a very faint current of something that Marcus took a moment to identify as wariness. The wariness of someone who had been right about something and had not been listened to, and was now receiving a call that suggested possibly the consequences of not being listened to had arrived. "Priya," Marcus said, "thank you for calling back. Your message said Linden Court." A pause. "I've been waiting for this call for about 14 months. "I know," Marcus said. "I should have made it sooner." "Yes," Priya said. "You should have." She was not going to make this easy. He had not, in all honesty, expected her to. "Do you want to meet in person, or do this on the phone?" Marcus looked out the car window at the South Side moving past. "In person," he said. "Today, if you're able." "I'm able," Priya said. "I have been able for quite some time." They met at the Heartland Housing Defense Office, in the conference room above the tortilleria, which had 4 mismatched chairs and a whiteboard covered in housing policy frameworks, and a window that overlooked a courtyard where a mural of a family outside their home covered the entire side of the adjacent building. The father in the mural was holding a set of keys. The family was smiling. Someone had painted them very large, with great care, so that the keys caught the light. Priya was 41 years old and had the particular quality of composure that Marcus associated with people who had been angry for a long time and had found something productive to do with it. She set a manila folder on the table between them and left her hands flat on either side of it, not opening it, just letting it sit there. "Before we talk about the file," she said, "I want to say something." "Okay, when I filed that flag, I believed it would be read. Not just received, read. I understood that executive teams get a lot of documentation and that not every annex is read and that this is operationally understandable." She kept her eyes steady on his. "But I also want you to know that I knew when I filed it that what I was describing was not an abstraction. The threshold interaction, the way the dynamic pricing module would hit hardest on the households that had the least margin, that was not a theoretical concern. That was a projection I made based on the income distributions in our portfolio. I modeled it. The model told me that between 3 and 5,000 households in the lower income brackets would hit non-renewal territory within 24 months of full rollout. I put that in the annex. And then I left because I realized the company had decided to answer the question with the model rather than with the people. Marcus said nothing for a moment. How many have been removed so far? Priya opened the folder. She slid a piece of paper across the table. Based on public eviction records in the jurisdictions where Hale Residential operates and cross-referenced with the Clarity System's implementation timeline, she said, my best estimate is 641 households since February of last year. That's households, not individuals. Marcus looked at the paper. The number sat there on the page, 641. He thought about each of those households having a Carmen, someone sitting on a bench somewhere explaining what they'd gone without to pay the rent before the computer decided their number was wrong. He looked at the mural through the window. The family with the keys. Tell me what you think needs to happen, he said. Priya looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time since he'd arrived, something shifted behind her eyes. Not softness, exactly, but the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for a particular question for a very long time and is taking a moment to make sure they answer it correctly. She picked up her pen. Okay, she said. Let's start. The folder that Susan Park placed on Marcus Hale's desk at 4:47 that afternoon was 3 inches thick. Susan set it down with both hands, the way you set down something you want to be noticed, and she stood on the other side of the desk with her hands clasped in front of her and said, I want to walk you through it. How bad? Read it first, Susan said. Then we'll talk about how bad. Marcus read it. The capital expenditure memo for the Clarity System Dynamic Market Pricing Module was 14 pages long. It was well written, which was a quality Marcus had always demanded of his documentation. Crisp, evidence-based, with clear recommendations and quantified projections. He had approved the budget attached to it in a board meeting on a Thursday in November, a meeting that the calendar record showed had lasted 11 minutes, which was 3 minutes shorter than the average board meeting under his tenure, and which he did not specifically remember, because it had been the week of the Midwest Portfolio Summit, and he had been in 4 cities in 5 days and was operating on the compressed attention of someone managing too many things simultaneously. He had initialed the memo cover page. He had not opened the annexes. Annex C was titled Risk Assessment, Threshold Calibration and Demographic Impact Modeling. It was 7 pages long. It was authored by Billionaire, Chief of Staff, VP Operations. It was dated October 29th. The board meeting had been November 7th. The annex had been in the package for 9 days before the meeting, and Marcus had initialed the cover page and the budget authorization and had not opened it. He read Annex C now. He read it in its entirety, which took him 22 minutes, because Priya was a precise writer, and he owed her the precision of reading her precisely. The core finding was this. The proposed rent-to-income threshold of 45%, later adjusted to 50%, would function as intended for most of the portfolio. But in markets where Hale Residential held significant concentrations of lower-priced units, and particularly in units that had been below market rate at acquisition and had not been repriced in 5 or more years, the dynamic pricing module would generate rent increases that could move a significant number of existing tenants with stable payment histories and long residencies, exactly the tenants a rational landlord should want to keep, across the non-renewal threshold. Priya had modeled 3 scenarios. In the base scenario, she estimated 2,900 to 4,400 households would be affected. In the high scenario, the number reached 6,100. She had attached a table of affected properties by metro area. Linden Court was on the table. It had been on the table, with a flag notation, for 9 days before Marcus initialed the budget authorization. And then, beneath the table, she had written a paragraph that Marcus read 3 times. It should be noted that the households most likely to be affected by this threshold interaction are those with the longest tenure and the most consistent payment records, a counterintuitive outcome of the model's optimization logic, which prioritizes rent-to-income ratio over payment history. The practical effect is that the tenant's Hale Residential has relied on most reliably for revenue stability will be the first to be flagged for non-renewal. This creates a risk not only in terms of community relations and public perception, but in terms of the operational logic of the system itself. We would be removing our most stable tenants in favor of new tenants at higher rents, with no certainty that those higher rents are sustainable at current income levels in these markets. I recommend that any implementation include a manual review override for tenants with payment histories above 95% over a 24-month period, which would protect both the company's relationship with its tenant base and its long-term revenue stability. A manual review override. 47 out of 48 months. Diane Reyes would have cleared that bar by 34 months. She would have cleared it the way a person clears a bar that was set specifically with her in mind, because Priya Nair had in fact set it with people like her in mind. And the recommendation had sat in an annex that Marcus had not opened, and the board had approved the budget. And 18 months later, 641 households had been removed from their homes, and Diane Reyes was at a shelter on West 51st with her children and 7 cardboard boxes. Marcus put the folder down. Susan had been standing quietly on the other side of the desk this entire time. She was good at that, at the particular patience of a lawyer who understands that some moments require the absence of sound. "Tell me the legal exposure," Marcus said. "Disparate impact," Susan said immediately, which told him she had been thinking about this since she pulled the file. "The demographic concentration of affected tenants. Priya's modeling is going to track with what we'd see in a full audit. Lower-income tenants, longer tenancy tenants, predominantly in properties in majority Black and Latino neighborhoods on the south and west sides, in South Dallas, in parts of Houston and Detroit. If the pattern holds, and I think the pattern holds, we have significant Fair Housing Act exposure. I'm not telling you we lose if this goes to litigation. I'm telling you the exposure is real and material." "What are the odds someone sues?" "Someone already has," Susan said. "Pro bono housing advocacy out of Cook County. They filed a complaint with HUD 6 weeks ago. I'm aware of it. I was monitoring it. I was going to bring it to you when it progressed." She paused. "I should have brought it to you sooner." "Yes," Marcus said. "You should have." He said it without anger, which he thought was the most honest way to say it because the anger, if there was any anger, was pointed somewhere closer than Susan. "What else?" "The PR exposure is significant. If this becomes public, and given that there's already a HUD complaint, it will become public. The company's positioning around the homes for every American brand narrative will be a liability rather than an asset." "It already is," Marcus said. He stood up and went to the window. The city was darkening into evening, the lights coming on across the skyline in the gradual way they did in fall when the days got shorter, and you noticed it happening in real time if you were paying attention. He watched the lights for a while. He thought about Priya Nair writing those 7 pages. He thought about the folder sitting in the board package for 9 days. He thought about 11 minutes. "I'm going to suspend the Clarity System's non-renewal function," he said, "across the full portfolio. Tonight." Susan was quiet for a moment. "The board." "I'll deal with the board." "Marcus, the operational implications." "I know the operational implications. I built the operational structure. I know exactly what it costs to suspend the automated system and revert to manual review." He turned from the window. "I also know that we have been removing households at a rate of approximately 45 per month since February of last year, and I approved the system that did it, and I did not read the page that told me it would do exactly this." He picked up his phone. He looked at it. He set it down. "I'm going to call Thomas tonight." Well, Thomas Blackwell was the chairman of the board. He was 71 years old, had been a Hale board member since the Series B raise 8 years ago, and was not a man who responded well to unilateral decisions by management. Marcus had, in the entire history of their relationship, made exactly one unilateral decision without board consultation, and it had taken 18 months to repair the relationship. "He's going to push back," Susan said. "I know. He'll say the liability exposure from acting precipitously without board consultation is worse than the underlying issue. He'll say that, yes. Is he wrong?" Marcus thought about the answer honestly. Thomas was not, from a purely legal standpoint, entirely wrong. There was an argument for a more measured approach, a staged review, a consultant's assessment, a structured communication plan before any operational change. There was an argument for protecting the company's legal position by demonstrating thoughtful deliberation rather than reactive suspension. There was also a woman at a shelter on West 51st who was going to be there tomorrow morning if Marcus spent tonight on a deliberate, thoughtful communications strategy. "He's not wrong about the legal argument," Marcus said. "He's wrong about what matters." Before you hear the rest of this story, let's step out of it for a moment. Because what just happened in Marcus Hale's office is not a plot device. It is, in its basic structure, something that happens every single day in this country. Not always in real estate, not always with an algorithm, but always with the same essential architecture. A decision gets made at a level where the consequences are legible only as numbers, and the people those numbers represent don't have a voice in the room. In the United States, according to the Princeton Eviction Lab, approximately 3.6 million eviction cases are filed every single year. Not all of them result in removal. Many are settled, withdrawn, or dismissed. But roughly 900,000 to 1.1 million actual evictions are carried out annually. That is more than 2,000 families a day. Each one involves boxes. Each one involves, somewhere, a child who doesn't fully understand what is happening. The research on automated rental pricing systems, algorithmic tools that use market data to recommend or set rent increases, is relatively new because these systems are relatively new. But the studies that exist suggest that in markets where these tools are deployed, rents increase faster than in comparable markets, and the tenants most likely to be displaced are those at the lower end of the income spectrum, regardless of their payment history. The algorithm doesn't know about 47 out of 48 months. It knows about a ratio. The cost of carrying out an eviction in the United States, legal fees, processing, unit preparation for re-rental, vacancy loss while a new tenant is found, averages between $7,500 and $10,000 per unit, based on estimates from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and property management industry data. Keeping a stable, long-tenured tenant who pays reliably costs virtually nothing. The economics of evicting your most reliable tenants to chase higher rents at scale are, when the full cycle is modeled, often deeply unfavorable. The algorithm that told Craig Sutton the portfolio was performing at peak efficiency was, in a meaningful sense, not counting everything that it was costing. Marcus Hale called Thomas Blackwell that evening. He told him he was suspending the Clarity System's non-renewal function immediately across all 47,000 units in the residential portfolio. He said he understood this would require an emergency board meeting. He said he was calling to give Thomas advance notice as a courtesy and that the operational directive was going out tonight regardless of the board's response. Thomas told him that was unacceptable. Marcus said he understood. Thomas told him the board would move to remove him from operational authority if he acted without authorization. Marcus said, "Call the meeting, Thomas. I'll be there." He hung up. He looked at the folder on his desk. He looked at the window, where the city had gone fully dark while they were talking. He sent the directive to the system operations team at 9:17 p.m. The emergency board meeting was held 9 days later on a Monday morning in the 31st floor conference room, which had a view of the lake that was very beautiful and that none of the 9 people seated around the table appeared to notice. Thomas Blackwell had requested, in writing, that Marcus submit to a formal review of his operational decision-making capacity. 5 other board members had signed the letter. That was a majority. Marcus had read the letter on a Saturday morning over coffee, and had set it on the kitchen counter and had gone for a walk, which was something he hadn't done on a Saturday and longer than he could accurately remember. He came to the meeting prepared. He had spent the 9 days between the directive and the meeting in a way that he would not have recognized as his own working style a year ago. He met with Susan Park every morning. He had 4 conversations with Priya Nair, long ones, 2 of which ran past midnight because Priya did not stop working at midnight, and neither did Marcus. He commissioned an internal audit, not of the Clarity System's profitability, which he already knew, but of the full impact over 18 months. How many households, which properties, which cities, what proportion had payment histories above 90%, what the projected costs were for unit preparation and re-rental against the revenue gained from the increased rents. The audit took 7 days and produced a report of 212 pages. Marcus read all 212 pages. He did not skip the annexes. He walked into the board meeting and set the report on the table. "I made a decision," he said, before Thomas could open the meeting formally. "I want to explain it, not defend it. Explain it." Thomas, to his credit, let him. Marcus spoke for 40 minutes. He walked the board through the Clarity System's origin, the budget authorization, the board meeting 11 minutes long that Marcus now regarded as the single most expensive 11 minutes in the company's history. Not in terms of the money authorized, but in terms of what was subsequently not read. He walked them through Annex C. He walked them through the 641 household figure, which Priya had since refined with more data to 683. He walked them through the HUD complaint, which Susan presented in parallel. He walked them through the audit findings, which showed that of the 683 households removed, 71% had payment histories above 90% over their tenancy period. He walked them through the cost modeling that showed the net revenue gain from the pricing module against the full life cycle cost of eviction and re-rental was substantially lower than the Clarity System's performance metrics suggested. Then he said, "I'm also going to tell you about Diane Reyes." He told them about Diane Reyes. He told them about 47 out of 48 months. He told them about Leo's drawing. He told them about Carmen on the bench in the shelter hallway, holding her coffee like a small weapon, telling him about school shoes at the Goodwill on Halsted. He told them because he had learned, in the 9 days since he'd sent the directive, that the numbers mattered, and the story also mattered. And the story mattered not less than the numbers, but alongside them. That both things were true simultaneously. And that a company that only spoke numbers had made this particular set of numbers inevitable. When he finished, there was a silence. Constance Wheeler, who managed a pension fund that held 8% of Hale Residential's equity, and who had been on the board for 4 years, and who was, in Marcus's assessment, the most genuinely rigorous thinker in the room, said, "What's the remediation plan?" Marcus slid the second folder across the table. The proposal had 4 elements. First, immediate creation of the Hale Stability Fund, a dedicated operational reserve of $18 million to be used exclusively to support tenants in non-renewal situations where payment history was above 90%, and the trigger for non-renewal was a rent increase generated by the dynamic pricing module rather than a tenant-initiated failure to pay. Second, a 90-day manual review period for all pending non-renewals, during which no automated lockout would proceed without a human review and sign-off. Third, a policy change making Annex C's recommended review override permanent. Any tenant with a 95% or above payment history over 24 months would require VP-level sign-off for a non-renewal to proceed. Fourth, engagement with Diane Reyes directly to offer her unit back at her previous rent and a 36-month rate freeze guarantee, and to ask, not require, ask if she would be willing to participate in a public conversation about the company's policy changes. Thomas looked at the folder. The $18 million fund comes out of what? Q3 operating reserve, Marcus said. It reduces EBITDA by approximately $3.2 million for the fiscal year. The board did not authorize that expenditure. No, Marcus said. The board also did not read Annex C. He let that sit for a moment, not unkindly. I'm asking the board to authorize it now. I'm also telling you that if the board declines, I will be resigning the operational role. He paused. And if I resign, the HUD complaint, the audit findings, and the fact that a majority of the board was aware of this situation and declined to remedy it will become part of the public record in whatever way Priya Nair and Susan Park between them think is most appropriate. There was a longer silence. Constance Wheeler said mildly, "That sounds like a threat." "It's a consequence," Marcus said. "I've spent 30 years in this business building systems that scale. This is a system that scales too. The difference is that it scales in the other direction." The vote was 6-3 in favor of the remediation plan. Thomas voted against. 2 other members who had signed the letter voted against. Marcus noted their names, not with anger, but with the specific clarity of someone who understood that the next board cycle would need to look different. Craig Sutton resigned the following Thursday. He sent Marcus a letter, not an email, a letter on paper, that said he believed the Clarity system was the right tool for the company and that he could not in good conscience remain in a role that required him to oversee its suspension. Marcus wrote back, also on paper, and said he respected Craig's position and wished him well. He meant it. Craig had built something that had worked, for a certain definition of working, and he had built it in good faith. And the fact that good faith could produce 683 households in shelters and vestibules was the entire lesson of the last 2 weeks. And Marcus did not think Craig was the villain of that lesson, any more than Marcus was its hero. Priya Nair accepted the role of Director of Tenant Policy and took a week to give notice at Heartland Housing Defense, which she did with considerable guilt and which Marcus told her was appropriate, and that he hoped she would maintain her relationships there because he intended to engage the organization as a policy development partner, and he needed her to have a relationship with people who would tell her honestly when the company was falling short. 6 weeks passed. Diane Reyes did not call. Marcus did not push. He had told Carmen at a second meeting that Carmen had agreed to and that Diane had again declined to attend, that the offer stood and that there was no deadline on it, and that if Diane chose never to come back to Linden Court, he understood, and that the unit would be held at her previous rent regardless. Carmen had listened to all of this and then said, "You know what the hardest part is? She liked that apartment. She'd made it into something. She hung curtains she sewed herself. Leo had a thing he did with his dinosaur toys on the windowsill, this whole setup he'd built." Carmen looked out the window of the coffee shop where they were meeting, on 51st Street, 3 blocks from the shelter. "He keeps asking her when the dinosaurs are going home." Marcus sat with that. On a Tuesday in October, 7 weeks after Linden Court, Marcus received a text from a number he didn't have in his contacts. It said, "This is Diane. I want to talk. Not about the apartment. I want to talk about what you said to the board." He replied within 30 seconds. They met at a diner on Cottage Grove, Diane's choice, neutral territory, 2 blocks from where her mother had lived before she died, which Diane did not tell Marcus until halfway through the conversation in a way that suggested she had told him because she had decided somewhere in the preceding weeks that she was going to tell him real things rather than managed things. She was still in scrubs. She was on her way to a late shift. She ordered coffee and a piece of pie, and she set her hands flat on the table and looked at Marcus with the eyes that he had first seen in the vestibule. Dark and tired and utterly without deference. "I'm not going to thank you," she said. "I know. What you did. The fund, the policy change, that's what you should have done to begin with. You don't get thanks for fixing what you broke." "I know," Marcus said. "My kids lost 6 weeks of their school year to a shelter cot and a gymnasium." She said it without heat, which made it land harder than heat would have. "Mia had nightmares for 3 weeks. Leo was okay, actually. Leo is more resilient than he should have to be, which is its own thing. She took a sip of her coffee. I'm not coming back to the apartment. Marcus waited. Not because of you, Diane said. Because I found a place in Bridgeport with Carmen. Better school district for Mia. We can afford it with both incomes. And I'm going to take the RN program at city colleges in the spring. She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. I just needed you to know that the offer wasn't what mattered to me. What mattered to me was whether you actually changed anything. Did I? Marcus asked. It wasn't rhetorical. Diane considered. Come talk to the city council, she said. There's a hearing next month on the Tenant Protection Act. The alderman's office has been trying to get someone from a major property company to show up and actually support it instead of fighting it. If you do that, if you go there and say the things you said to your board, in public, on the record, then yes, you changed something. She pushed the untouched pie toward the center of the table. You should come, she said. I'll be there. And if you say something wrong, I'll tell you. Marcus looked at the pie. He looked at Diane Reyes, who had paid 47 months of rent and sewed her own curtains and was going back to school in the spring and who was, he understood completely, not doing any of this for him. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. On November 14th, Marcus Hale testified before the Chicago City Council's Committee on Housing in support of the Tenant Stability Protection Act, a bill that would have required landlords of buildings over 10 units to provide 90 days notice before non-renewal, mandate human review for any automated system-generated non-renewal affecting a tenant with a payment history above 90%, and establish a mediation process before lockout proceedings could begin. He spoke for 11 minutes, somewhat longer than the board meeting. He told them about Annex C. He told them about 47 out of 48 months. He told them about the cost modeling that showed stable tenants were an economic asset, not a liability, and that the industry's adoption of algorithmic pricing tools had created a structural incentive to displace exactly the tenants that rational portfolio management should protect. He said, I built a system that moved faster than my understanding of it. I approved the budget before I understood the consequences. I am telling you this not because I am asking for credit for the realization, but because I think the policy environment needs to be structured so that operators like me cannot make this mistake. Or so that when we do, the people affected have recourse that does not depend on the owner walking past the right door on the right morning. He sat down. Diane Reyes testified next. She spoke for 8 minutes. She talked about the curtains she had sewed and the dinosaurs on the windowsill, and the late fee in June 2022, and what it meant to sit in that vestibule and not know, yet, that anything was going to change. She did not look at Marcus while she spoke. She looked at the alderman. She was talking to the people who had the power to make the rule, and she knew who she was talking to. The Tenant Stability Protection Act passed committee in January. Full council vote was scheduled for spring. 1 year after the morning on the sidewalk outside Linden Court, the Hale Stability Fund had intervened in 3,140 cases across 11 states. The Clarity System's non-renewal function had been redesigned with Priya Nair's override protocol built into the core architecture. The portfolio's revenue was down 2.1% year over year, a fact that 3 analysts noted in quarterly reports with varying degrees of alarm, and which Marcus addressed in an investor letter that said, in part, the short-term revenue adjustment reflects a long-term investment in tenant stability. Stable tenants pay for longer. We have 30 years of our own data on this. We chose to stop ignoring it. Constance Wheeler called him after the letter was published. She said, 4 of my fund's portfolio companies have asked me who wrote that. Marcus said, tell them it was drafted by a woman named Priya Nair with input from a woman named Diane Reyes. Constance said she would. Linden Court was renovated that spring. Not gutted, renovated, with the residents' input on what mattered and what could wait, a process that took longer than the standard approach and cost more per unit in the short term, and that produced, in Unit 2C, A set of new curtain rods where the previous tenant's hardware had pulled slightly away from the wall, which no tenant in the building had ever reported, because the kind of person who pays 47 out of 48 months of rent on time does not generally file a complaint about a curtain rod. The new tenant in 2C was a home health aide named Rosa, 56 years old, who had been on the wait list for a stable unit in the South Side for 16 months. She moved in on a Thursday. She asked the building manager if she could paint the kitchen walls a pale yellow, and the building manager called Priya, who called Marcus, who said yes immediately. Rosa painted on a Saturday. On the last day of October, Marcus received an envelope in the mail at his office. No return address. Inside was a piece of paper, folded twice. He unfolded it. It was a crayon drawing of a house. It had a peaked roof and a door and 4 windows and 2 figures standing outside. And in the upper left corner, where there might have been a sun, there was instead a small blue stripe. The color of the door frame on Linden Court. The color of a quart of paint from a hardware store on Cottage Grove. The color of a choice made at 17 years old that had survived 37 winters, and the weight of forgetting, and the particular kind of damage that comes from choosing for too long the numbers over the people. There was no note. There did not need to be one.